There's a house in Texas. A quiet, unassuming place, the kind of house you drive past without a second thought. But behind its walls, something else was waiting, something watching, something collecting. The bodies appeared one by one, dumped in deserted lots, cold and lifeless. And yet, something was missing. Not their wallets, not their jewelry, something far more intimate, far more unsettling. Eyes. Gone without a trace, taken with precision, removed as if they had never belonged there at all. A killer was out there, but he didn't just want to kill. He wanted to keep something for himself. A trophy, a reminder, a secret no one else was meant to understand. This is the story of Charles Albright, a man whose past held quiet horrors, a man whose hands were trained for precision, but whose mind concealed something far more disturbing, a man who turned his darkest obsession into something real. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of true crime, subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell the stories that most fear to remember, and this one is just beginning. Charles Albright was born in 1933 in Amarillo, Texas, but the story of his life did not begin with his birth, it began with a choice. A woman, strict yet intelligent, took him in as her own, shaping his future with a firm hand and an unrelenting belief in discipline. She was not an ordinary mother. She demanded excellence in all things, molding him into a bright, capable young boy, one who read well beyond his years and excelled in his studies. But beneath the structured lessons and carefully cultivated intellect, she nurtured something far more unusual, an obsession that would one day lead him down a dark and horrific path. From an early age, Charles was introduced to something most children never encounter: taxidermy. While other boys played outside or collected baseball cards, he was learning how to take a lifeless creature and make it seem alive again. But there was one part of the process that unsettled him, one thing that made every taxidermy project feel unfinished: the eyes. The dull, glassy replacements never looked quite right, never captured the essence of what once was. His mother encouraged him to perfect his craft, pushing him to develop a steady hand with the scalpel, to remove and replace with precision, to pay attention to the small details. But this was more than just a hobby. It was an introduction to something that fascinated him on a level far deeper than anyone realized at the time. As Charles grew older, his fixation remained, quietly weaving itself into the fabric of his life. He was charming, intelligent, well-spoken, qualities that made him blend seamlessly into the world around him. No one suspected that behind his friendly smile and well-mannered demeanor lurked a mind consumed by something far more disturbing. While others saw a promising young man with a bright future, Charles saw the world through a different lens, one in which control, precision, and perfection were everything. For years, his fascination remained just that, an unusual but harmless interest. But obsessions rarely stay contained, and in time, the boundaries that separated curiosity from compulsion began to blur. What happens when someone who has spent their life perfecting the art of removing eyes begins to see them not just in animals, but in people? What happens when the quiet interest of a child transforms into the unrelenting hunger of a man who cannot ignore the urge any longer? No one could have predicted what Charles Albright would become. No one could have foreseen the terrifying evolution of a boy with an unusual hobby into a man whose crimes would leave a trail of fear and horror across Texas. The answer is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. From the moment Charles Albright could walk and talk, his mother made it clear, he was not just any child. She had adopted him, and in her eyes, that meant he was chosen, special, destined for greatness. But her version of greatness was not one of warmth or encouragement, it was one of control, of strict discipline, of relentless demands for perfection. She believed that intelligence was the most valuable weapon a person could possess, and she made sure that Charles wielded his well. From a young age, he was pushed far beyond his peers, encouraged to read, to learn, to absorb knowledge like a sponge. She made sure he was always ahead of the other children, always excelling, always proving that he was smarter, faster, better. But behind the push for academic brilliance, behind the carefully cultivated image of a gifted child, lurked something darker, something growing in the corners of his mind, taking root in ways even his mother could not have foreseen. One of the most unusual aspects of Charles's upbringing was his early exposure to taxidermy. His mother, ever eager to expand his skill set, introduced him to the practice when he was still just a child. She taught him how to skin animals, how to preserve their bodies, how to recreate them into something that looked alive even after death. But there was one part of taxidermy she never allowed him to complete. The eyes. She refused to buy him the glass replicas that would make his work feel finished, forcing him instead to use crude alternatives, buttons, beads, anything but the realistic, glistening eyes that would have given his creations the spark of life they were missing. For Charles, this was more than just a simple restriction. It became an obsession. The eyes were everything, the final detail, the missing piece, the one thing that could turn a lifeless husk into something that seemed almost real. But no matter how much he begged, no matter how much he insisted, his mother never gave in. And so, while other children played with toys and built forts, Charles spent his time staring at his half-finished creations, their empty sockets a constant reminder of what he could not have. He learned to work with a scalpel with an unnerving level of precision, cutting and shaping with a surgeon's steadiness. His hands became tools of meticulous craftsmanship, each movement calculated, controlled. But deep inside, the frustration festered. His mother's control did not stop at taxidermy. Every aspect of his life was micromanaged, shaped, and dictated by her iron will. She controlled what he ate, what he read, how he spent his time, who he spoke to. She pushed him to excel, but she also suffocated him, leaving him no room for personal freedom, no space to develop his own sense of self. And yet, despite the rigid discipline, despite the constant demands for excellence, there was another side to Charles that she could not fully rein in, a side that was learning how to manipulate, how to deceive, how to take what he wanted when no one was looking. As he grew older, his charm became his greatest asset. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and quick-witted. He knew how to make people trust him, how to say the right words, how to present himself as the perfect young man. But behind the charm, behind the clever words and bright smile, he was learning how to lie. The first signs were small, petty thefts, little acts of deception that went unnoticed or were quickly forgiven. He forged documents, stole from classmates, manipulated those around him with ease. And the more he got away with, the bolder he became. It was not just about taking things, he wanted to see how far he could push, how much he could get away with before someone caught on. His intelligence made him dangerous. He could talk his way out of trouble, spin lies so convincingly that even those who suspected him found themselves second-guessing their instincts. Teachers praised him, friends admired him, and his mother continued to push him forward, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, that the son she had so carefully shaped was beginning to unravel in ways that no amount of discipline could contain. But the true darkness had not yet surfaced. At this point, Charles Albright was still just a boy with a fascination for eyes, a talent for deception, and an ever-growing need to control the world around him. No one yet knew what he would become. No one suspected that, beneath the surface of the well-mannered, intelligent young man, something was waiting. Watching. Waiting for the moment it could finally break free. Dallas, Texas, December 13, 1990. It was a cold, quiet morning when a passerby stumbled upon a horrifying sight, a woman's lifeless body discarded on a lonely stretch of road, her presence unnoticed until the rising sun illuminated the horror left behind. Her name was Mary Pratt, a well-known sex worker in the area, and she had been murdered with chilling precision. But it wasn't just the fact that she had been killed that sent waves of unease through the police force, it was the way she had been left, the gruesome signature that would come to define a string of murders more unsettling than anything the city had seen in years. Her eyes were gone. Not gouged out in a frenzied attack, not mutilated in a way one might expect from a brutal killing, but removed with an almost surgical level of precision. The sockets were clean, the cuts exact, as if someone with knowledge of anatomy had carefully extracted them. There was something calculated about the act, something deeply disturbing about the idea that the killer had not only taken her life but had also taken something more, her gaze, her expression, her very ability to see. For the detectives called to the scene, it was a moment of eerie disbelief. Murders were not uncommon in Dallas, especially in areas where violence and desperation often walked hand in hand. But this was different. This was meticulous. This was deliberate. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that she had fought back, which made the crime even more unsettling. Had she known her killer? Had she been taken by surprise? Or had she been subdued so quickly, so effectively, that she never even had the chance to react? These were the questions that swirled in the minds of investigators as they examined the body, struggling to comprehend what kind of person would commit such an act, and more importantly, why. At first, the case seemed like an anomaly, a shocking but isolated tragedy. But then, on February 10, 1991, less than 2 months later, another woman was found dead under eerily similar circumstances. Her name was Susan Peterson, and like Mary Pratt, she was a sex worker. And like Mary Pratt, she was left with one chilling detail: the complete absence of her eyes. Once again, the precision was unmistakable. This was no random act of violence, no haphazard attack driven by rage or impulse. Whoever had done this had done it with intent, with care, with a level of expertise that suggested more than just a passing knowledge of the human body. This time, the message was clear. This was not a one-time crime. This was a pattern. This was the work of a serial killer. The Dallas Police Department found itself gripped by an unsettling realization: there was someone out there hunting women, not just to kill them, but to take something from them. And it wasn't money. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even their dignity. It was their eyes. The growing horror among detectives was palpable. They had seen brutal crimes before, but this? This was different. This was calculated, methodical, and worst of all, it was happening again. By this point, the streets had begun to whisper. Among the vulnerable women of Dallas' red light districts, fear spread like wildfire. Someone was out there, and they were targeting people just like them. But who, and why? Theories circulated, each one more terrifying than the last. Some believed it was an unhinged surgeon, someone with a macabre fascination for human anatomy. Others whispered about a collector, a man who saw his victims not as people but as objects, pieces of a grotesque puzzle he was slowly assembling. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that the killer was not finished. And then, just over a month later, he struck again. March 18, 1991. The third body was discovered. Her name was Shirley Williams. But unlike the first two victims, Shirley was not a sex worker. She was a schoolteacher, a woman whose murder shattered the emerging pattern and sent investigators into a frenzy. Why her? Was this a mistake? Or was the killer evolving, shifting his methods, expanding his selection? The questions were as unsettling as the crime itself. But this time, there was something different about the body. The removal of her eyes was not as clean. The careful precision that had defined the first two murders seemed rushed, almost frantic. There were signs of struggle, indications that something had gone wrong. Had the killer been interrupted? Had he made a mistake? Or was he simply growing impatient, his hunger for his gruesome ritual beginning to override his meticulous nature? 3 victims. 3 women. 3 sets of missing eyes. For investigators, the weight of the case had become suffocating. They knew they were dealing with someone whose crimes went beyond simple murder. This was someone with a fixation, an obsession that dictated every aspect of his killings. But who was he? What drove him to do this? And most importantly, when would he strike again? The answers, as it turned out, lay in an unexpected place. The city of Dallas had been gripped by a terror unlike anything it had seen before, a creeping horror that settled into the air like a sickness, turning even the most ordinary of nights into something unsettling. 3 women had been murdered, their bodies discarded as if they were nothing more than lifeless shells, but it wasn't just the killings themselves that sent waves of unease through the streets, it was the horrifying and methodical manner in which their eyes had been removed, stolen with a level of surgical precision that spoke of something far more calculated, something obsessive, something deeply disturbing. The victims had not been brutally attacked in the traditional sense. There were no signs of prolonged struggle, no defensive wounds that would suggest they had fought back. Instead, it was as if they had been caught in a moment of complete vulnerability, unable to react before the darkness closed in around them. Whoever had done this was careful, patient, and knew exactly what they were doing. The police were chasing a ghost, a predator who left behind no tangible evidence, no carelessly discarded weapons, no damning traces of his identity, only the unsettling voids where eyes should have been. Leads were scarce, and frustration within the department grew as each day passed without a suspect, without an answer, without justice. But then, finally, a breakthrough emerged, a whisper, a name muttered by those who lived and worked in the same forgotten corners where the victims had last been seen alive, a man who had drawn attention not because of anything overtly threatening, but because there was something about him that didn't quite fit, something that set him apart in a way that no one could quite put into words. The witnesses all described him the same way, an older man, well-dressed but oddly present in a place where men like him did not usually linger, a figure who moved with an unsettling air of confidence, as if he was never out of place even when he clearly was. He had been seen time and time again near the women who would later be found dead, though never in a way that seemed overtly suspicious at the time. He was not a client. He was not a pimp. He was not one of the usual faces in the night. Yet he had been there, always watching, always returning, as if something about the area drew him in like a force he could not resist. The detectives took these accounts and combed through their records, searching for any name that might match, any known individual with a history that might suggest a darker side lurking beneath the surface. And then, there it was, a name that leapt off the page like a specter rising from the shadows of the past. Charles Albright. For seasoned investigators, it was a name that carried weight, a name that had passed through the system before but never in a way that suggested the kind of horror they were now dealing with. His history was a patchwork of crimes that spoke to a mind shaped by deception, petty thefts, forgeries, manipulations that allowed him to slip through the cracks of the law, always skirting the edges of something bigger, something worse. He was intelligent, dangerously so, his charm masking something beneath the surface, something that had now, it seemed, finally boiled over. Armed with their new suspect, the Dallas Police Department moved swiftly, securing a warrant and descending upon Albright's home, their minds racing with the possibility that the answers they had been desperately searching for might finally be waiting behind that door. At first, the house seemed unremarkable, too neat, too carefully arranged, the kind of order that suggested a need for control. But as the search deepened, as they pushed past the carefully curated surface, the unsettling details began to emerge. It was the photographs that struck them first, not of family, not of friends, but of eyes. Dozens of them. Torn from magazines, clipped from books, removed from their original context and hoarded in secret, as if they were pieces of something sacred, something worth preserving. The images were everywhere, a collection built over time, studied and obsessed over in a way that made it clear this was no passing interest. And then there was something even more disturbing, hidden among his possessions, carefully preserved strands of hair that, when analyzed, would later be matched to the very women whose bodies had been left mutilated in the night. But the most damning discovery of all lay within his taxidermy tools, an array of scalpels, tweezers, and delicate instruments meant for the precise handling of lifeless flesh. And there, nestled among them, was the final, horrifying piece of evidence. False eyeballs. The sight of them sent a wave of unease through the investigators. They had read the case files. They had seen the crime scene photographs, the gaping, empty sockets left behind in each victim. And now, in the possession of the man they had been searching for, lay the grotesque trophies of an obsession turned deadly. There was no longer any question. They had their suspect. But now, they had to bring him in. It was in the early hours of March 22, 1991, that the Dallas Police Department made their move, surrounding Albright's home before dawn could fully break, before the city had even begun to stir. The officers moved with precision, knowing they had only one chance to do this right. They had no way of knowing how he would react. Would he resist? Would he attempt to flee? Would they find themselves face to face with a man who had been capable of carrying out such calculated, gruesome crimes? The knock came hard and deliberate against the door, shattering the silence. For a moment, nothing. Then, the sound of movement from within. Footsteps. Slow, measured, and then, the door opened. There stood Charles Albright. His face betrayed nothing, no shock, no confusion, no fear. He did not lunge, did not argue, and did not beg for an explanation. He simply stood there, his eyes, dark and unreadable, staring back at them with a stillness that was almost more unsettling than if he had fought back. He allowed them to take him, allowed them to place him in handcuffs, allowed them to lead him into the cold, early morning air where the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars cast eerie shadows across his face. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains, watching as the man who had once been just another quiet figure in their community was led away, and the weight of suspicion finally closing around him like a noose. The nightmare had a name. And now, the question remained, would there be enough to make him pay? The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and those who had followed the gruesome case with morbid curiosity, all eager to witness the unfolding of what had become one of the most chilling murder trials in Texas history, a case that had captured the public's imagination not just because of the brutality of the crimes but because of the eerie and calculated precision with which they had been carried out. The cold and methodical way the victims had been mutilated, their eyes taken. With the skill of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone whose obsession had finally spilled over into something monstrous. As Charles Albright sat at the defense table, calm and composed, his expression unreadable, the prosecution wasted no time in painting him as a man whose lifelong fascination with eyes, rooted in his childhood lessons in taxidermy, had warped into something sinister, something beyond mere curiosity, something that had driven him to commit the kind of horrors that no ordinary man could fathom. They laid out their case in painstaking detail, piece by piece, ensuring that the jury understood the sheer weight of the evidence against him, not a smoking gun, not DNA, not fingerprints, but a web of circumstantial clues that, when woven together, painted a picture so damning it was nearly impossible to deny. They spoke of the witnesses who had seen him with the victims in the days leading up to their murders, his presence a recurring thread that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, a connection that suggested he was far more than just an innocent bystander. They presented the disturbing photographs of eyes found in his home, a collection that hinted at an obsession so deep it was impossible to ignore, a fixation that had taken root long before the first body was discovered. They pointed to the strands of hair found hidden among his possessions, strands that forensic testing revealed had belonged to the victims, the undeniable link between Albright and the women who had met such a gruesome end. And then, most chilling of all, they revealed the false eyeballs found among his taxidermy tools, the eerie detail that sent a shiver through the courtroom, a detail that seemed almost too perfectly aligned with the crimes, as if Albright had, in his own twisted way, kept trophies of the thing he valued most. The defense, in turn, fought back with everything they had, arguing that there was no direct evidence tying Albright to the murders, no fingerprints at the crime scenes, no murder weapon recovered, no eyewitness who had seen him commit the acts. They painted him as a scapegoat, a man with a strange hobby and an unfortunate past who had been unfairly targeted because of the eerie parallels between his interests and the crimes themselves, a convenient suspect rather than a proven killer. They pointed to the lack of blood or any physical trace of the victims in Albright's home, suggesting that if he had truly been the murderer, surely there would have been something more concrete to place him at the scenes of the crimes. And Albright himself maintained his composure throughout, never once breaking down, never once showing signs of guilt, his calm demeanor unsettling in its own right, as if the entire ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, an absurdity that he refused to entertain. But in the end, despite the absence of physical evidence, despite the defense's attempts to cast doubt, the jury could not ignore the overwhelming weight of what had been presented before them. The connections, the obsessions, the eerie precision of the crimes that mirrored Albright's own lifelong fixation with eyes. And so, after hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty. Convicted of the murder of Shirley Williams, Albright was sentenced to life in prison, his fate sealed within the walls of a maximum security facility where he would remain for the rest of his days, his strange and unsettling legacy forever etched into the annals of true crime history. But even as the courtroom emptied, as the gavel's final strike echoed through the chambers and the world moved on, one chilling truth remained. To this day, Charles Albright insists he is innocent. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Even after decades, the case of Charles Albright remains one of the most disturbing and haunting in Texas history, a grim and unsettling tale that still sends shivers down the spine of those who dare to revisit its details. The sheer brutality of the crimes, the unsettling precision with which the victims were left without their eyes, and the eerie connection to Albright's lifelong obsession have cemented this case as one of the most bizarre and terrifying to ever unfold. And yet, despite his conviction, despite the so-called resolution in a court of law, lingering doubts still creep through the cracks of justice. Were there more victims, women whose disappearances were never linked to Albright, whose bodies were never found, their eyes perhaps taken as trophies in the same chilling fashion? Did investigators uncover the full extent of his crimes, or did some secrets go to the grave with him? Some believe the case is closed, that the monster was locked away before he could strike again. But others whisper a different possibility, that the real killer may have been someone else entirely, that Albright, as he always insisted, was innocent of the crimes pinned on him. As the chilling details of Charles Albright's case settle in, the question remains. Was justice truly served, or did the real monster slip through the cracks? Was Albright an unhinged predator, his obsession with eyes driving him to unspeakable horrors? Or was he simply the perfect suspect, a man whose dark past made him easy to blame? The evidence was compelling, but the doubts, they linger. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Charles Albright truly guilty, or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you crave deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime, the cases that keep you awake at night, the mysteries that refuse to be buried, then you're in the right place. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week, we have another shocking case that you won't believe.